The middle class didn't disappear. It moved, and that changes everything. You've heard the warning for years. The middle class is shrinking, hollowed out, falling behind. It's used to justify tariffs, wage mandates, massive spending, redistribution. But here's the contradiction hiding in plain sight. What if the middle class is smaller, not because people are sinking, but because millions are rising? That question matters to you because it shapes how politicians explain your frustration and what they try to fix in your name. A new analysis by economists Stephen Rose and Scott Winship looks at the middle class differently. Instead of defining it relative to the national median, they use fixed purchasing power, what people can actually buy as incomes rise. What we know from their data is striking. Since 1979, the share of Americans in the upper middle class rose from about 10% to 31%, while lower middle and poor shares fell. Now, here's the part nobody says out loud. If that's true, why does the story of middle class collapse feel so convincing? Because this isn't just about money, it's about something else breaking beneath the surface, and that's where the story flips. At the center of this debate is a quiet framing trick most people never notice. When politicians say the middle class is shrinking, they rarely explain how they're measuring it. Most studies define the middle class relative to the national median income. As the country gets richer, the line automatically moves upward. That means even if everyone's standard of living improves, a fixed share will always fall below the middle by definition. Rose and Winship deliberately reject that approach. They measure the middle class by fixed purchasing power, same standard, same real buying ability. Under that lens, something unexpected happens. The core middle class does shrink, but not because people are falling. It shrinks because people are moving up. This reframes the entire issue. The real question isn't why are Americans doing worse, it's why does progress feel like decline? And more importantly, who benefits from keeping that confusion alive? Because once you see the pattern, the rhetoric starts to look very different. Here's the claim that cuts against the dominant narrative. The middle class isn't being hollowed out from below. It's being pulled upward. And the data is explicit about that. Since 1979, the share of Americans classified as upper middle class rose from about 10% to 31%. At the same time, the shares considered lower middle class or poor fell substantially. That's not stagnation. That's upward movement. Former President Joe Biden warned of a hollowed-out middle class, language that implies decline and downward mobility. But notice what's missing from that story. There's no acknowledgement that by fixed purchasing power, real incomes have risen and millions of households crossed into higher tiers. This is where the story quietly breaks. If the data points up, not down, then the fear people feel isn't coming from income alone. It's coming from something the numbers don't directly measure. And that's where the escalation begins. For most of the 20th century, moving into the middle class meant something very specific. It wasn't just a paycheck threshold, it was a position, a shared center of gravity. Being middle class meant you were the representative American. Your lifestyle, your habits, your tastes were the default. That status carried social affirmation along with economic security. Now compare that to today. As prosperity expanded, culture fragmented, more media, more platforms, more lifestyles, more ways to live well. We know this from the text itself. We no longer all watch the same television programs or consume the same news. Fewer institutions define a single mainstream. Here's why that matters. Upward mobility used to come with recognition. Now it comes with ambiguity. People move up economically but feel less anchored socially. What should feel like success starts to feel like loss. This is where the normalization happens. Economic progress without cultural cohesion starts being described as economic failure. And once that framing sets in, the entire debate shifts. Here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. We're told the middle class is collapsing, But the same period shows rising real incomes and millions moving into the upper middle class. So why does the anxiety keep intensifying? Because the story people are offered doesn't match their lived experience. Cultural fragmentation feels like economic betrayal. The loss of a shared middle is interpreted as proof that something was taken. Populism steps into that gap with a simple answer: blame elites, blame markets, blame growth itself. But here's the detail that changes how you see it. The discomfort isn't coming from decline, it's coming from abundance. A richer and freer society, the text says, produces more choice, more pluralism, and fewer gatekeepers defining what's normal. Notice what's being reversed. Success is being narrated as failure. And once that switch flips, policies designed to restore the middle class start targeting the very forces that lifted it in the first place. That's when the real pressure begins to build. Now watch how fast this escalates. Even as incomes rise, frustration doesn't disappear. It concentrates. The text is clear about where the pressure actually comes from. Housing, healthcare, higher education, three of the biggest household expenses, three of the most heavily regulated and subsidized sectors in the economy. This is the squeeze people feel every month. Rent climbing faster than paychecks, medical bills that don't reflect real market competition, college costs inflated by barriers on who can provide education and how much can be supplied. These aren't abstract forces, they're lived constraints. Here's the key distinction. This isn't proof that growth stopped working. It's proof that distorted markets amplify stress even during prosperity. What happens if that distinction keeps getting ignored? Shift the camera to yourself for a moment. You might be earning more than your parents did at the same age. You might technically be better off, but when housing eats more of your income, when healthcare feels unpredictable, when education costs feel unavoidable, progress feels fragile, that's the disconnect. Upward mobility exists on paper, but daily life feels tighter. Not because opportunity vanished, but because essential systems are harder to navigate. You're told you're winning, yet you feel boxed in. This is where resentment grows, not from ideology, but from friction, from the sense that every step forward comes with new constraints. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because the story doesn't stop at frustration. It moves into how power responds to it. Here's the part mainstream coverage rarely slows down to explain. Systems don't respond to feelings. They respond to incentives. When large sectors like housing, healthcare, and education are heavily regulated and subsidized, prices stop reflecting supply and demand. Scarcity becomes structural, complexity becomes permanent, and pressure gets locked in. This creates a political feedback loop. Rising costs produce anxiety. Anxiety produces demand for intervention. Intervention adds new rules and protections. Those rules raise barriers and prices even more. And the cycle tightens. This isn't about villains. It's about mechanisms. When growth continues but access narrows, people experience success as exclusion. That's the quiet engine underneath today's middle-class unease. And once you see that engine, the next phase becomes easier to predict. From here, the trajectory splits, but neither path is abstract. One direction doubles down on the dominant narrative. If the middle class is assumed to be collapsing, policymakers reach for restoration, more trade restrictions, more cartel-like favoritism for government-favored industries, more heavy-handed interventions sold as protection. The text warns this clearly. Policies framed as middle-class rescue can end up suppressing growth and turning real gains into real losses. The other path starts with a harder admission that upward mobility is still happening, that the frustration is real but the diagnosis is wrong. In that path, the focus shifts from stopping growth to removing the barriers that distort it. Here's why the moment matters. The next move is already forming. The question is which story wins. Here's the insight that reframes everything. The middle class didn't shrink because America failed. It shrank because America succeeded and then struggled to adapt to that success. When more families cross into the upper middle class, that's not erosion, that's expansion. But when cultural identity, shared institutions, and essential markets fail to keep pace, success starts to feel unstable. Politicians exploit that tension by promising to restore something that hasn't actually been destroyed. The danger isn't change, it's misdiagnosis. Confusing the costs of success with failure leads to policies that sabotage the very mobility still delivering real gains. This story isn't finished. The pressure points are still moving. And the next layer, how these narratives harden into permanent policy, is already unfolding. Follow for the next breakdown, because this is where the consequences become irreversible.